really great week. This week I want to chat to you about the difference between handmade and homemade and how you can give your garments more of a professional finish. So I'm going to start by saying that there's nothing wrong with either word, handmade or homemade. What I mean by the difference is that sometimes the term homemade can have negative connotations. Sometimes it can look a little bit homemade, whereas when we make something by hand, we don't necessarily want it to look like it's been made by hand. So I don't want anyone to take any negativity from use of either word, but it's just an expression that we use quite a lot, so handmade, not homemade, and just a more professional finish on your garment. So I'm going to give you my top 5 tips, but first I thought I'd mention what I'm wearing because I love this. This is a new Linden sweatshirt that I've literally just sewn up. So if I'm looking a bit hot and flustered, it's because I've had the heater on in the studio and the irons, and I've been sewing really quickly. This is a really beautiful Liberty sweatshirting that I got. It's not one that I stock, but I bought it from the lovely Fabrics Galore at the Knitting and Stitching show. Actually no, I bought it from the Handmade Fair a couple of weeks back, and that just shows you that yes, I do own a fabric shop, but I also have an uncontrollable fabric addiction and I love supporting other businesses as well. So I'm not sure if they've still got it, but you can check out the Fabrics Galore website if you love it as much as I do. Sorry, it's quite late in the day and I feel like I'm having a very bad hair day. Anyway, before I get into the vlog, it would be amazing if you could subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you already have, then thank you so much. I'm sorry I constantly bang on about it, but if you haven't, it would be amazing if you could join in, hit the subscribe button down there, and leave me a comment if you like the video. So my top 5 tips. These are things that you can do whether you're a complete beginner or someone who has been sewing for years, and in fact I think that they're a really good reminder for someone who's been sewing for years, because sometimes we like to skip these simple tips, and it does make a difference to your finished garment. Also, I think if you're a beginner, it's really good to get into these habits right at the beginning so that you end up with garments that you're really happy with. So tip number 1. This is right at the beginning, before you've even cut your fabric. Let's talk about the grain line. The grain line is marked on your pattern, and it is really important that when you lay out your fabric you measure and check your grain line. It's really common and really easy, and I'm very guilty of doing this myself, of just plonking your pattern piece on your fabric or trying to play a little game of Tetris because you want to eke out as much of your fabric as possible and save that little bit at the end that we never have anything to do with anyway. But the grain line is super important because if you do not put your fabric on grain, you risk, 1, having slightly twisted seams. So if you've ever sewn, or even that's a good look, wasn't it? If you've ever sewn or worn anything that feels slightly twisted, maybe like a twisted sleeve or a twisted leg on trousers, that's often because it's been cut off grain. Secondly, if you have any kind of pattern, when you lay your paper piece down on your fabric, it's very easy to think it looks straight, but then once you have cut it out and sewn it up, if you've got any form of directional print, it's very obvious if it's ever so slightly off, and we could be talking 1 or 2 centimeters can make a big difference. So it's really worth making sure you pin one end of your piece, measure in the distance from the edge of the fabric, and then make sure you measure the bottom of the grain line marked on the pattern piece as well, so that you know it is 100% correct. The other tip that is also part of tip number 1 is checking the nap of your fabric, and this is really important, especially at the moment, because velvets and corduroys are things are coming back into fashion, because now we're hitting autumn, winter and party season. If you have a fabric with any kind of nap, and by nap I mean the feel of the fabric, so the way the velvet and the corduroy, I'm doing this because this is how you tell, it can look like it's the same either way. Once you sew it up, if you've got it in different directions, again, it will be hugely obvious. So if you put a pair of trousers that you're sewing out of corduroy and you put one leg one way and then you turn the other leg the other way because it fits better and you think it looks the same, trust me, when you sew it together, it is going to look very, very wrong. And that is one of the really obvious ways to show that you've made your clothes yourself. And there's nothing wrong with people knowing that you've made your clothes yourself. In fact, as you all know, I shout about it all the time. I love making my own clothes. I love helping other people make their own clothes, but sometimes you just want them to look as professional as possible. So yeah, tip number 1, grain line and the nap. Tip number 2, again, this is 2 things in one and they are very, very commonly missed off. So the first part is to always stay stitch your necklines. This is something, again, pretty much all of these I'm very much guilty of not doing at times, and I have come to the conclusion over the last few years that if I'm going to sew something, I want to sew it properly and I'm going to put the time and effort in. So stay stitching is where you sew a straight line of stitching all the way around your neck pieces, your neck pattern pieces, before you have assembled any of your pattern pieces together. So if you were making a dress or a top, for example, and it had a curved neckline, you do this in woven fabrics, by the way, not in jersey fabrics, you would stitch all the way around with a straight stitch within the seam allowance. So if your seam allowance of your pattern is 1.5 centimetres, you would stitch your straight line of stitching at say 1 centimetre because it would be hidden in the seam allowance. And the reason that it's really important to do that is because it stops your neckline pieces from stretching out. When you cut something on a curve, it cuts into the fibres on the bias, and that means that they're really easily stretched. And if you've ever sewn anything up and found that the facing piece doesn't quite fit the neck piece, very often if you haven't stay stitched, that's because the fabric on your neck piece has stretched out slightly, because as you're working with it and you're stitching it up, those bias fibres are stretching. Putting that stay stitch, that line of straight stitching in, will just stop that neckline from stretching out, and it means that everything will fit nicely and your neckline will sit much nicer. So the second part of that is also about the stitching, and it is understitching. So this is just a sample from the shop, so I've just grabbed it from the rail. So understitching is where you sew your seam allowance. I'm hoping you can see. So this is my seam allowance, and I have sewn a line of stitching, which you can see there, to my facing. And what that means is that from the right side, this is the facing, you can see the line of stitching just on the facing, but when the dress is turned the right way out, the understitching, which it doesn't like focusing because I've got my face in it, the understitching ensures you can't see any of that facing poking out. If I didn't understitch, what would happen is, can you see that little facing starting to poke over the top? It would roll up and out. So understitching, again, is a really quick and simple way of making sure that your necklines and your finish is really good, which is ironic because I'm wearing a jumper where my neckband is ever so slightly too long, so I'm going to have to take this in so that it sits flatter. But again, I'm talking about with woven garments here. So understitching, and you can do that, if I show you on this sample, this is in fact one that I talked about on my vlog last week, the Sew Over It Betty dress that I've been sewing up, and it's pretty much finished, it just needs a hem, but there is an all-in-one neckline, and sorry, all-in-one neck and armhole facing, and can you see how neatly the neckline sits? Again, I'll hide my eyes, and the armhole, because in here it's all been understitched around the edge. So it just stops your facings from rolling to the outside. It's the same if you are putting a lining in. Again, understitch everything. You are attaching your seam allowance to your facings or your lining, and it stops it from rolling up, and again, stops it from looking a little bit unprofessional. I'm going to show you this dress obviously at the end of the month when I do my makes video. Tip number 3, everyone's favourite. Ironing, pressing, whatever you want to call it. I always say in classes we call it pressing because then it seems less boring than ironing, because no one likes ironing, although some people tell me that they do. So pressing is really important. So you need to press as you go, because you need to make sure your seams are nice and flat when you sew over. Pressing out your seams can also get rid of any waviness. If you have got the odd little pucker, a hot steamy iron, obviously appropriate heat for your fabric, can really help with that. And nothing screams homemade more than a garment that has been made and not pressed as you've gone. So press your seam. If you sew a seam before you then join something to it, so for example a bodice and then you're putting a skirt onto it, press those darts, press those seams before you put another seam that's going to overlock it, because that will stop it looking puffy and wavy, and it really makes a huge difference. There are a couple of tools that I use regularly which really help with ironing and pressing. So they are these. Don't these look interesting? This is a ham. This you can use when you're trying to press but you don't want to press out a curve. So i.e. it acts instead of your breast. So if you are pressing out darts and things, you don't actually want to press your bust darts I should say, completely flat, because you want the bust darts to give you some shape. So you can put a ham underneath it, and this is just filled with sawdust. And it's a really compact sawdust, and I think, in fact I'm pretty certain that Tilly on her website has, I will stop fiddling with my hair, I know it's really annoying, Tilly on her blog has a tutorial of how to make your own ham, because I think Susie back in the day made her own ham. And this is another really useful tool. This is a sleeve ham. So again, if you're pressing sleeves, the seam of sleeves, or even trouser legs, or anything that's a bit narrow and a bit fiddly and you can't get it onto the end of the ironing board, you can put this in and then press your seam over that. That's really helpful. And then the third thing that I use a lot more regularly than I thought I would when I bought it is this. It's a block of wood, but it's actually called a clapper. Sometimes they have handles on the top, but this, I think you could use, so this is obviously pine, but you can use any sort of soft wood. Don't quote me on that. I think you can't use dark wood and things like mahogany and teak and stuff, because it needs to be able to absorb the heat. So with a clapper, when you are ironing, sometimes your seam allowances are a bit springy and they don't want to stay down, and that can happen with thick and heavy fabrics, so things like wool and denim, but also with unnatural fibres, so like crepes. If they're polyester crepes and things, they can be quite springy. So you use this by using your iron as normal, and then each time you take the iron off the part of the seam that you're pressing, you press and hold this piece of wood on it, and by some scientific miracle the heat that is in your fabric is absorbed by the wood. You can tell I would never be a science TV presenter. It's absorbed into the wood and it cools the fabric down whilst keeping your crease or your seam or your hem in place, and when you lift it away it is much flatter. You can also finger press, so after you've put your iron on it you can just press your hand on it until it cools down and lift it off, but you can quite often burn your hands, I have done, and the clapper is much more effective. So clappers and hams and pressing, really important, makes a massive difference to your garment. Tip number 4 is all about finishing your seams. So nothing, I keep saying this, nothing screams handmade like the tip I've just mentioned. Nothing screams handmade like a really unfinished seam with threads unraveling and loose thread tails, etc. Jersey, you don't need to finish your seam, so it's absolutely fine. With a woven fabric, ideally you would use a zigzag stitch, an overlocker, or a pinking shears, so zigzaggy scissors, to finish your seams so that they don't fray. This not only makes your garments last a lot longer, it means that they look a lot nicer on the inside. And I know that not many people see the insides, but again, I find that when I'm looking at the inside, I want it to look nice too, because I've put a lot of time and effort into making something, so I want it to look good either way. If you don't want to use those 3 ways of finishing a seam, then there are obviously other ways like French seams and Hong Kong seams, and they are really lovely. They do take a little they do take a little bit more time, but they are really, really worthwhile. And like if I'm making something out of a particularly special fabric, or something that's actually quite simple, I want to give it a really lovely finish, I'll often use French seams, or things like jackets and coatigans. Using a Hong Kong seam, which is a bias band seam, is really, really lovely. But yeah, think about the inside as well as the outside, and to kind of flip that back to the beginning, that also ties in with how you cut your fabric. So do try and cut your fabric as neatly as you can. Use really sharp scissors or a rotary cutter to get a really nice neat finish, because that will mean that your seams look nicer when you've sewn everything up. And it might be only you that sees it, and if you don't care, then don't worry about it. But if you do want to make them look a bit nicer, think about how you're going to finish them. My final tip is about hemming, everyone's favourite bit, or it is for me anyway. So when you get to the end of your garment, it can be really tempting, because you want to finish, just to machine hem everything, and I do that a lot. Hands up, do that all the time. And for casual things like skirts that are going to be for everyday wear, and dresses that are going to be for everyday wear, just a normal straight stitch round on the machine with a double folded hem is absolutely fine for me. But if I've got something that is a little bit more special, something again that I put a lot of time in, or it's a particularly special occasion outfit, then I do look at different hems. So you could, using this one as an example, this one has a completely hand finished hem. So I'm going to hold this dress up. This was a fabric we had in last year, and I made it and wore it for a wedding. It's a sew over Etta dress. Tilly and the Buttons Etta dress, sorry. But you can see from the right side there, you cannot see any hem stitch line. So what I've done is, there we go. There we go. I have hand stitched that. So you take a larger part from the actual folded up seam, a larger stitch from the folded up seam, and then a really, really tiny single piece of thread from the fabric on the main part of the dress, so that from the right side you can't see it. And I've done the same on this one on the sleeves as well, so they're all hand sewn. And don't get me wrong, I sewed this dress in a hurry, and I was hand stitching this in the car on the way to the wedding. So I did go back afterwards and do my hand stitching again to make my stitches a decent length, because they were about that far apart, just to keep it up for that day. But I knew I wanted the dress to last, and I knew that I didn't want to see a line of machine stitching on it, so I hand stitched it. The other way you can do that with a little bit less hand stitching is to use a blind hem foot on your machine. That is never quite as invisible as hand stitching it, but it is close and it looks a lot nicer than just having a line of stitching around the bottom. I would also think about how you finish your jersey hems. So just because you don't have to finish them because they don't fray doesn't mean that you shouldn't. Using a double needle can give you a really nice finish, or I often use a zigzag in a either matching or contrasting thread, but it's up to you. And again, press your hem. Press it, press it, press it again, because very often, because it's the last bit that we sew, we're so keen to get wearing, we perhaps don't press our hems as much as we can, and then they can end up looking quite wavy or bubbly, and it takes 2 seconds. All of these things that I've just talked about, all of these tips are really quick. They might add on an extra 5-10 minutes at a time for each one, so overall maybe an hour or so, but it is so worth it. Your garment will look so much nicer, so much better finished, and it will last you longer. And then every time you put it on, like this dress, every time I look at this dress, I am so pleased with how it looks on the inside. The seam edges are all finished and they're pressed open. The hem is hand stitched. And that's not to say I don't have things at home that don't look anything like this, because I do. It's all about balance, and sometimes if I'm in a real hurry and I'm making something really quick and it's a wearable toile, then I'm not going to do any of those things I've just mentioned. But what you don't want to happen is for you to have your beautiful fabrics, sew them up, skip those stages because you just want to save a little bit of time, and then find that you're disappointed with the finish. So hopefully those tips help you to just get that more handmade rather than homemade look. I hope you found that useful, guys. I was going to do a show around the shop with a load of the new fabrics that we've had in for autumn winter, but it's dark now, so I need to do that next week. And I was also going to do my Joni I don't know why I'm still holding that there like I'm wearing the other dress. I was also going to do my Joni tutorial, but I'm really sorry, I can't find my pattern pieces anywhere, and I think I've left them in France, because the last time I made a Joni dress was when I went to our family, my grandparents' house in France, some of you might remember, and I haven't seen the pattern pieces since, and I've torn the shop apart, I've torn the house apart, can't find them, so I'm going to have to retrace off the whole thing, which just gives me a headache even thinking about it, but I'm going to do it, I promise. Anyway, enough of my rambling. Those are my top 5 tips. Have a great week, guys. If you have enjoyed this video and you found it useful, please leave me a comment below, give me a thumbs up and subscribe. Hope you have a really good one, and I will see you again next week. Take care, bye.